Hello and welcome to the Torvus podcast. My name is Ari and this is episode 10. On tonight's episode, we're going to be tackling the legend of Thor, both in mythology and in the Marvel universe, both comics and the movies. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about the God of Thunder, and let's get into it. Gentlemen, welcome to episode 10 of the Torvus podcast. We're going to be tackling Thor tonight. How you guys doing?
Doing great. Not sure we're actually going to tackle Thor. He's one tough customer.
Yes, he is. Thor, probably the most powerful Avenger. That's what I'm going to say. I'm
Maybe
throw
not
that
the
out
strongest in some people's mind, but
So we're going to talk about the mythology around the Norse god of Thor, Odinsson, and how he shows up in the Marvel universe, and how he compares to the Viking mythology. So we're going to kind of go down this rabbit hole here, and we'll see kind of where it takes us further. I should put it out there right now that I have a replica of Mjolnir sitting on the table here, and I am a massive Thor fan. And if you know who I am and you know what I'm about, you can obviously figure that out pretty quick. So Thor I have always loved since probably a small child, and in front of us right now there's a collection of Thor comics that goes back several years that Jason and I actually were talking, because we both kind of got into Thor at the same time in the Marvel comic aspect and timeline. So it was between issues 300 and 400, right?
that's my peak era, is 300 to 400.
And there's some great comics during that time. It led to, God, so many adventures, and I was so happy when they finally made the Avengers and the MCU came out, and they actually did a Thor film that was bang on, rather than the, I don't know if you remember the old Incredible Hulk. Yeah, so Lou Ferrigno playing the Incredible Hulk. So they did, I believe in the late 80s, they did a made-for-TV film, and they had Thor in it. And did you ever see this, Alex?
You showed me on this. We talked about this in the first episode.
Oh, yeah, right, yeah. Right, so I showed him. So anyway, so they have Thor. He's got like this fur coat on, and his hammer is like, it's really small.
And the fighting was just...
The budget's a little better, production value is a little higher now.
Yeah, so let's, before we get maybe talking to the actual Marvel stuff, let's talk about kind of the mythology of Thor and Norse mythology and stuff like that. And Alex, you kind of know a little bit about that stuff, right?
That's how I was kind of first introduced to Thor, was through the mythology. I was read Greek myths when I was younger, and sort of it branched out into Egyptian and Norse from there. Yeah, it was a bit of a shock for me, like, you know, the comic book Thor as opposed to the Norse mythology Thor. A lot of the old school myths and legend are quite savage and brutal, and especially when you look at that's what's fun about going back into the mythology, is it's not quite as watered down as a lot of the newer like fables and whatnot, right? It's still, someone pisses you off, you smash their face in. That's what Thor was about.
Yeah.
So I grew up with that Thor. In my mind, he was savage, strong. Like, he would, if he was mad, he got mad, you know, and that's kind of the legend and the myth that I knew.
And one of the things the Norse people and the Vikings in particular, Thor wasn't like a chaotic good god. I mean, they worship him because of his strength. But the thing about Thor is he was angry and surly, and if you pissed him off for whatever you did, then he was a god of retribution. He wasn't like Odin. Odin was really the all-father.
And like Odin was kind of, he had that omniscient fair, like there was a lesson, there was a morality, like there's a way through with Odin.
Right.
With Thor, it was like, if you fuck up, this is the consequence, and it suits the crime, so to speak. Like, it's very eye for an eye type mentality. One of my favorite myths is Loki, his younger brother, where his wife, Sif, is known for her beautiful long blonde hair.
Yeah.
And in one of his pranks, he cuts her hair. So Thor beats him to within an inch of his life for cutting his wife's hair. Because Loki also isn't the same as in the... You know, Loki's not a maniacal bad. He's chaotic, but it's neither good nor evil. It's just chaos for the sake of chaos.
He's a trickster.
He just does pranks and pisses people off, and he often felt Thor's wrath And in this case, this was probably, besides his final punishment, which when he was chained to that rock with a snake dripping venom into his face. But besides that, this was the most savage beating he's ever received, simply for cutting Thor's wife's hair, which I thought that to me kind of summed up the Thor that I knew, you know.
And the thing about Thor and Loki, I mean, that goes back and forth, their relationship, and he was always playing these pranks on him and illusions, right? Yeah. It's like at one time, Thor ended up going and he was drinking out of this goblet, out of a giant's goblet, yes, right? Yes. And it ended up being the ocean. And he kept drinking and drinking and drinking, and the goblet wouldn't go down, and Thor couldn't figure out what it was. And well, the illusion was he was actually drinking from the ocean, so of course he's not going to finish the goblet. Yeah, you know, and it's very interesting. Yeah. And the other one I really like is he ended up fighting a giantress and used Mjolnir and was smashing her head with the hammer, and it wasn't doing any damage, and he just kept going over and over and smashing it. And then when the illusion was lifted, he had actually leveled a mountain range because he was actually throwing his hammer against a mountain range. Yeah. So it's stuff like that. Yeah, pretty cool. And when I grew up, I read a lot of Norse mythology and spent hours just reading that stuff. It's really cool now with the advent of audiobooks because there's lectures and things that I constantly listening to. So. Now, when you went from knowing the kind of that mythology and then seeing the Thor in the movies, totally different. Yeah. But had you read any comics before that or anything?
No, I hadn't read any of the comics. The only way that I knew Thor was through the Avengers. I knew he was a member of the Avenger and through the Avengers comics. I hadn't done any specific Thor. The first single Thor thing I'd actually seen is when it came out, that first movie with Chris Hemsworth. Yeah. That was the first time I actually solely saw a Thor solo thing. Before that, that to me was a weird, it was a strange thing. I was like, why is Thor a member of the Avengers? I didn't get it. I thought, people were like, oh, that's not like Norse mythology Thor. That's the MCU Thor. And to me, I immediately just discredited it because it was like, whoa, what are they doing? What's happening here?
Well, it's different, I guess. And since Jason and I both grew up with reading the comics and things, Jay, when Thor came out in the Avengers and that thing,
to me,
what was it like?
Mine was the opposite of Alex. I was like, there was Thor first, then there was Thor in the Avengers. Like I remember Thor independently first before being. I do remember as part of the Avengers, but I.
Oh, you mean independently in the?
Yeah, I remember primarily being Thor because most of my comic book stuff is. I collect like Thor and Conan and Gru. Those are my three main comic collections. Yeah. So I come from a fantasy side. So I mean, I was also into the Avengers and stuff, but it was through Thor that I got into the Avengers rather than getting into. No, I got into the Avengers through Thor rather than Thor through the Avengers. Yeah. It's kind of opposite experience. Right. Me.
And the thing about Thor, so he was he was created by Stan Lee. And his first comic actually came out. He debuted in 1962 in the Journey into Mystery, and that's when he first kind of made his appearance. And Mjolnir, obviously being the big tool that he uses, his hammer, made out of a special material. Now, they say that the material comes from the heart of a star. Sometimes they call it a metal. It depends on who you're kind of asking. And Mjolnir had many abilities and was supposed to be indestructible. And one of the things they talk about, it's a little different in the actual mythology, but Mjolnir can't be lifted by a being who's not worthy. Yeah. And we kind of talked about this a little bit before, but is it you're not worthy, or is it so heavy? Like, what's the thing that prevents it from being lifted? It's because you have to be worthy. It's the enchantment.
Yeah, it's Odin's wizardry.
One of the best scenes, actually, that I remember, I think it was in the Avengers, is when the Hulk is fighting Thor, and he catches Thor's hammer, and it falls, and he grabs onto it, he's trying to lift it. And this was a little neat thing. When he tries to lift it, obviously it's not going to budge, but because the Hulk is so strong, you notice that the floor underneath him...
He starts breaking through the deck of the floating ship. There,
which would totally make sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of selective in the movies. Like, he's at, Jane's apartment, and he hangs up the hammer on the coat rack, and it's kind of selective of how heavy it actually is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So we had talked earlier about the 1988 film of the Incredible Hulk where Thor appears, and that was played by an actor by the name of Eric Allen Kramer, and that was the first incarnation of Thor on the small screen or big screen. Small screen because it was television. So again, very funny. You should check it out because the costume is ridiculous.
Yeah.
They also did this. Here's a little trivia for you. There is a singer that goes.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, we don't want to go down here.
This
Okay.
is what I was just going to go down.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead. Yeah.
okay, so I'll start it off. There's a singer that basically calls himself Thor, and there is a Netflix documentary on him, which is amazing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you've got to watch it. And
80s metal fucking legend.
What?
So he was an ex-stripper who ended up starting a metal band, and he was just a Thor gimmick, and he used to end up blow up a hot water bottle, and he'd get exploded and would bend bars.
And this was Thor from Myth or Thor from the comics? Like that? Did he dress like a blonde, like with a big cape and everything? Like so Thor from the comics.
Cheesy 80s glam metal.
Yeah, it's incredible. So he really wanted to play Thor. So
Thunder on the Tundra, great album.
Yeah, he's from Vancouver.
Really?
Yeah,
Canadian metal.
yeah.
Wow.
So he ended up contacting Marvel, and he contacted Stan Lee, and he's like, if you do a television show, I should be your Thor. I'm going to be your Thor. I'm the guy. You've got to see.
Oh my goodness.
I will pull up a picture so you can see it. Incredible. And there was a movie that came out in the 80s called Adventures in Babysitting. And they have this one segment in there where there's this mechanic and the kids are trying to get the car fixed. And there's a girl in there, she's absolutely obsessed with Thor. And all of a sudden you see kind of the hydraulics come down and this guy standing there and he's holding like a big mallet. And she's like, oh my God, it's Thor. And it's just this like blonde guy with long hair. And
right.
Anyway, he wanted to play that part, but they said no.
Oh,
yeah.
I see.
So, so to kind of get back to it, the comic books kind of went into the MCU. I think they did a pretty good job.
Oh, they did a great job.
Yeah. Did you like the movies?
I like the movies, yeah, a lot. They did a really good job with the movies, and they got better as it went along. I mean, the first two have got some rough spots in them, but the third one, the Ragnarok one, was definitely the best of the lot of them.
Yeah, that was.
And in fact, that's my favorite of all the Marvel movies that they've made.
Mm-hmm.
Was the third.
I like the first one to introduce the character, how they kind of showed his brutish, savage, like, I want to smash stuff. Like they did an homage back to the actual god, and then interacting with humanity and moving forward from there, which is great because obviously the Marvel universe takes Thor and kind of says this is what the legends were about, but this is who he is.
Yeah, they kind of have their own legends. They did a good job of showing his pride and vanity and arrogance and all that sort of thing in there. They did a different sort of origins thing slightly than they did in the comics, but they tied some of that stuff back in there nicely. Like the 60s Thor, he goes down, he gets sent down to Earth again for the same thing with Odin banishing him for his pride to sort of humiliate him and give him humility. And then they had him fighting these, because it's the 60s, he was fighting these rock men from Saturn or something like that. And interestingly, they didn't do that in the Marvel movie as an origin. They worked out the different thing for the Thor movie. But in the second one, where he's against the Dark Elves, there's one of the planets that or one of the realms that he's on, and he fights this big rock monster that comes out, and it actually looks like one of the Rockmen from Saturn. So they didn't do it, but it was a nice call out to the people like, hey, you changed his origin, but they called that back. So little touches like that. So even if you're going to change things, give a little nod to the original fan.
And one of the things about the Norse mythology that people don't know is they think that the gods were immortal. They actually were not immortal.
And that's what sets Norse mythology apart from almost any other mythology at the time, was that, the Greeks and the Egyptians, the Egyptian gods could die actually, but they never really did. But the Greek gods were immortal, could do anything. They were above everything. The Norse gods, they got hungry, they would starve, they could die. They went through the same struggles that every person went through as well.
The extreme longevity of the Norse mythology and those gods, it was different than the immortality of the Greek gods.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that part of that's due to the environment. If you look at the Mediterranean versus the Scandinavian environments, it's a much harsher place for people to live in. So the gods had to be dealing with harsher things. So
they didn't have that social structure where there was the palisades and the person who could just chill and be that almost, that emperor type figure in his white robes and having a bath every day. Like, you didn't quite get that level of royalty treatment.
You had to fight for your existence, like farming, just being fed.
Surviving.
In Scandinavia is different than in the Mediterranean, where the food almost grows itself.
The weather, winter is coming. That's a legit fear.
It totally. And that's why they were always, for good crops, and they were always like praying to the gods. It's like, please give us good crops.
And we don't even like pray for no winter. They're like for a merciful winter, like where there is sunshine after like a month of darkness and snow up to your
which
eyeballs.
is a little harder to grow the crops there than say southern.
Yes.
So Thor had some additional stuff, and he had his hammer Mjolnir, but he also had a belt which he wore, which
and
would
gloves.
But the belt itself would give him. They said in the Marvel comics that it would double his strength, and I believe if he used the belt, he would be weakened after it. That was one of the things. And then the other thing is he had a pair of gauntlets. And what were the gauntlets for?
In the mythology, the gauntlets were to make Mjolnir return to him. So he was able to throw the hammer and then have them come back. And I think in the comics, they just did a tribute to that in a couple episodes. I don't know specifically what they actually allowed him to achieve.
Well, I think in the comic, what they allowed him to... They protected him from when unleashing Mjolnir's power, like the maximum power. It was like kind of to help and stuff like that. But they don't really go into it.
I think they give him more strength, like in D&D in the first edition deities and demigods. I believe the gauntlets give him higher than most of the greater gods have, like 25 strength if they're like a fighter like god. But I think that with the gauntlets he gets to bypass even the god limit of 25. And so maybe in the comics, where they barely ever use the gauntlets, but there's some good episodes or issues, I guess, since we're talking about comics, early on in the 270s, where there's a reporter from Earth, Red Norvell, who is a human, but then he ends up stealing Thor's gauntlets and belt and becoming another kind of Thor. So he was a red-bearded Thor, at the time where Marvel's regular Thor was blonde with no beard, oddly enough.
Right.
And that in the Norse mythology, that's what eventually the blonde vision of Thor became such a popular thing in Western culture that's what Thor was outside of the comics. I don't know if Stan Lee truly invented that or not, but the first depictions of Thor that I had seen were of a very tall, red-headed, full beard, burly-looking man. It wasn't like a pleasant face. It was weathered and wrinkled, and that was the demeanor that he gave out.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key thing for the mythology Thor versus the comic Thor is the mythology Thor was never really punished or had any kind of negative connotation to his brutishness or his, embodying that manly anger, that wrath. That was something that was kind of encouraged, and that was the moral of the story was if you're pissed off, smash it, because that solves the problem.
But Marvel did a good job considering they were under the Comics Code Authority.
Well, and the times had to change, right? And I think they did a very good job, and I obviously I liken to the comic Thor far more than I do to the Norse Thor. Like, you can't have a god like that still making those, it has to change in order to be relevant to current times.
I'm saying is it depends on when the comics come out. If the comic was to come out, say if Thor was a later edition and he came out in the 90s, like say post-Punisher. In a post-Punisher era, I think you'd find it would be a different Thor. Like if Thor had come out, first of all, after the Punisher thing, when comics had turned darker, and people weren't all hung up on the Comics Code Authority shit, they would probably have a Thor that was more like that brutal Norse mythology Thor. But in the 60s, things were a little bit more...
But what I have to say is what I really like and what they did so well in the MCU is how Thor's relationship with Odin and that kind of passing of the mantle, so to speak, was as Odin, the all-powerful, all-father god, kind of training his son to eventually be the one who replaces him or whatever. But the fact that if your father is like that and you're invested in that relationship, how could you just be a meathead, douchebag smashing things? Like, it makes more sense, and I really like how the MCU presented that and his journey with his relationship to Odin.
And that's a very Marvel thing. That's what part of what Stan Lee brought to comics, was getting that human relationship thing brought into it.
And what they had to do for the MCU is they rushed that whole story. Like, if you look at the comics, it was Odin was always there, and it was Thor on adventure. That's what comics are about. But in the MCU, they had to kind of, okay, he's getting older. Oh, he's going to die. Now it's going to be, pass on to Thor. And
they had to remove him before Thanos became a problem.
I'm Odin. Kind of on a tangent here. Odin is very, very, very powerful in the Marvel universe.
Yeah.
And he is up there with some really heavy hitters in the Odin Force and stuff. And after he passes, and the comics actually do kind of go down to, there's this like Rune Thor and King Thor. He actually gets all of Odin's powers. He does all the same things that Odin did. So Odin removed one of his eyes so he would gain wisdom. And so King Thor and Rune Thor he actually removed both of his eyes so he'd even get more wisdom. Wow. And so they called it the Thor Force instead of the Odin Force.
Right.
So there's all this stuff that kind of that happens with that. And also in mythology and also in the comic books, Thor had two goats.
Thor. Thor.
So Thor had the two goats, which he basically pulled his chariot, and yes, he would eat them. So the tooth gnasher and tooth grinder, and he could eat them every night. And then when the sun would hit their bones, they would reanimate.
That's like just
perfect pet.
Yeah. But that's such a
like
Viking thing.
That's perfect thing. Like to have an animal carry your luggage or to get you from point A to point B, and then be able to devour it.
So Thor typically Jason refers to him as a glutton a little bit.
Yeah, we were just talking about the goats and how they regenerate for his food, and in the later Marvel movies, they have a thing where you've got the fat Thor, and some people made fun of it. It's like, oh, it's totally out of character, but it's like, no, Thor is a total glutton. He loves the booze, loves the food. It's like lots of different times. I mean, they get a little bit of the cross with the other characters. They have the Warriors 3 that you'll see a little bit in the movies that were also in the comics. So you've got like the big fat guy, Volstagg, that ate a lot. So Thor's not like that bad, but he does eat and drink a lot.
He likes to party.
Yeah. Like Doctor Strange gets him to drink and finally settles on the beer mug that auto fills itself.
Yeah, that was awesome.
That's exactly what he
bloody
wants.
brilliant. Like that's the drink for him. I would like one of those.
And another interesting factoid on that, kind of never-ending drink thing is Ari filled me in on the history of the drinking horns and why the Vikings used to drink out of horns, and it's because they can't put them down.
Yep.
So you'd have to finish your drink, and then you'd probably go and fill it up again. So the whole point of it was just you weren't able to put your drink down, and you just get so wasted until you just passed out.
Well, it was the height of poor manners to put down a drinking horn, right? So you constantly had to have it filled and had to be stuff in it. So anytime during the Viking Age that you would be partying with your fellow Vikings, they would be filling up your horn. It could never be empty.
Yeah.
Right? Until you passed out.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing. Like you can't put it down and it can't be empty. So and you can't not drink. So unless you're fighting. So you're either fighting or you're unconscious. Or you're drinking.
Yeah. Much better time.
Yeah.
So talking about Thor and his feats, we had talked about in the opening of this episode, we talked about his strength and the strongest Avenger. Now, Thor has some remarkable feats of strength in the comic books and also in Thor Ragnarok. So I had watched a YouTube video where it talks about how strong Thor is.
Right.
And I think I sent you guys a link.
Yeah.
Did you watch it?
Yeah, I did. I saw that one.
Pretty incredible. Like they go into the physics and things.
They go behind like what each kind of character's feats are and where his feats settle in the ranking.
Yeah. And Thor gets stronger and stronger in the MCU. But if you look at kind of the comic book version, Jason and I can remember some pretty remarkable feats of strength that he had. I'm going to go through a couple here, and then we'll kind of just talk about them. So Thor has held up a skyscraper before in the comic books. He pushed the world engine, which is the great tree, and basically, so I'm going to kind of go into this. So to better understand kind of the feat of Thor, pushing the world engine, it's called, it's important to understand Yggdrasil, and that is basically referred to as the world tree. It maintains the appearance of an actual gigantic tree, but it is in fact a cosmic pillar that guides time, destiny, and the nature, not for only Asgard, but also for all of the 9 realms. So nearly every planet is connected to the world tree in some way. So he, at one point in the comic books, ends up pushing this thing. A really interesting one that I really like, and the MCU has not touched upon this character yet, and they really should, is he accidentally knocked out Namor, otherwise known as the Submariner. Now, for those of you who don't know the Submariner, he's basically the Aquaman version of of the DC universe. Namor was first in the comics, and Aquaman is based off him.
Right.
And Marvel and DC go back and forth about stealing characters. They've done it for years, but in this particular instance, Namor was actually was designed first and written first, and then Aquaman came out shortly after.
Isn't Thor supposed to be Marvel's answer to Superman?
Yeah. But Marvel actually they have a couple of
Captain Marvel.
Other ones and stuff. Yeah,
Captain Marvel is like real life.
Yeah, but they're later.
So Namor is actually super powerful. I don't know if you know anything about the Submariner.
I do, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So he is a class 100 level strength dude, like really strong.
Phase rip, unearthly.
Oh, okay. Do you know the different levels and gauges? Do you remember them?
Yeah.
Okay, what are they?
Well, so there's Marvel role-playing game, Marvel superheroes. It's called the phase rip system.
Okay.
Anyway, so there's a different scale. They have a numerical scale, but they're also famous for using the word thing. So you'll have things like it'll go typical, 6, good, 10, excellent, 20, remarkable, 30, incredible, 40, amazing, 50, monstrous, 75, unearthly, 100, shift X, shift Y, shift Z, class 1000, class 3,000, class 5,000, and beyond are the scales, if I recall correctly. Someone can correct me in the comments and show how horrible my memory is.
Well, Jason did that from memory, just to let you know.
Because it's not real people in the real world. So
yeah, right. And what was Thor considered?
Thor is class 100, or not class 100. Sorry, unearthly. There we go. I had to make this.
That's class 100 though, isn't it?
But unearthly is the name. 100's the numerical.
But they had always said that 100 is 100 tons. That's what you could lift.
Yeah, they had different explanations at different times. And there's also, even if you're not into the Marvel superheroes game, the phase rip thing that I mentioned, there was other Marvel games later, but they also had the guidebooks to the Marvel universe, handbooks to the Marvel universe. Those comic things. They're basically an encyclopedia of the Marvel universe, and there's several different versions. Really hard to collect. Some of them are very expensive. But.
In the comic book, he broke adamantium cables that were wrapped around him. So out of all the materials in the Marvel Universe, the most notorious and arguably the most powerful is a metal known as adamantium. It is virtually indestructible. It's man-made metal alloy. Adamantium is the stuff that coats Wolverine's bones and makes him unbreakable, which helped also combine with his healing factor. Wolverine is nearly unbeatable. Now, pure adamantium is so powerful that beings like the Hulk can barely even dent it, much less break it. Villains like Ultron are known for constructing their bodies out of the material, which is actually, they did vibranium in MCU, making them virtually impervious to all harm. However,
Except it's magnetic. Just going to point that out there.
Yes.
Which Thor, technically, as being able to manipulate electricity, would be able to induce magnetic fields and therefore affect adamantium.
I love when you bring in
that out, if I could throw that out.
It's there. Because of the electrician in you.
Yeah.
That's awesome. However, in the Mighty Thor, number 309, the God of Thunder proves that he's more up to the task of breaking adamantium. As the issue begins, there's some high-tech thugs known as the Bombardiers, and they are highly advanced flying vehicle, and they're trying to destroy a building. And basically, eventually, Thor comes across the villains and knocks them out of the sky. When the criminals come out of the ship, they do so with jetpacks on their back, and they have all manners of offensive weaponry on them. One of their weapons is basically a wraparound rocket, and they're made of adamantium straps, which ensnare Thor like snaking cables. He's momentarily confused by the strength of these cables. Thor regains all of his senses when he realizes that innocents are in jeopardy. And by just then, he starts to flex, and Thor breaks free of the adamantium cables. That is incredible.
Yeah.
So he could basically break Wolverine in half.
Wow.
So I don't know.
Yeah, he's definitely at a higher level of superhero.
Yeah.
Yes. Thor has also, I'm going to name some other things he's done. He's knocked out the Phoenix Force before in the comic books.
That's insane, yeah.
Yep. He has cracked a celestial skull, which we're going to pause on this one. Okay. So this was issue 387, and this is when he ends up fighting the Celestials. And this is probably one of the best story arcs that Jason and I remember from the 300
If
series.
you'll recall from last episode where I mentioned in the monsters that Celestials were one of the great monsters because I think that they were the toughest thing that Thor ever fought.
Yeah, they did give him a hard time for sure.
Yeah, and so what happens is there's a celestial by the name of Exitar the Exterminator, and he's basically prone to destroying worlds completely, and he's a member of the celestial race, and basically Thor needs to get into his skull.
Literally.
And so he ends up using Mjolnir, and he bashes a small hole in his skull and goes in. So that is no small feat, I can tell you that. He once knocked over Galactus, which is massive, which I still think that they're going to introduce into the MCU.
They better. When the Fantastic Four get their
Yeah, they have
rightful place, they've got.
Well, they have all the rights now, so they should be able to bring that in
right,
for
so
sure.
Galactus and Doctor Doom will have to get into that.
In the comic book, he's also defeated Mangrog and Thanos back to back at one point during the comics. He's held up the Asgardian world. He did that with Beta Ray Bill. He's resisted the gravitational pull of a neutron star. He's broke free from the weight of 20 planets. He's punched a dimensional rift open. He has leg pressed 1 million tons. He has thrown a planet out of orbit by arm wrestling with Hercules. That was a good episode. That was a really good one.
Yeah.
He's destroyed the Silver Surfer's force field, which is ridiculous. He's lifted the World Serpent, which wraps around.
Oh, one of the best 2-panel scenes in a comic ever.
Yeah, it's so good. He's pushed over the Leaning Tower of Pisa with one finger.
Straightened it up.
Just straightened it up.
Let me fix that.
And in one of the greatest episodes in comics that I have read, he's fought this guy a few times with the Incredible Hulk, but he has matched
so many good fights they've had.
He has matched the Hulk's strength for an hour straight.
Yeah. Well, that's tough because the Hulk just gets more and more powerful the angrier he gets. So, like, the more he loses, the more, like, frustrated and angry, and it just becomes this ball of wrath. So if you can go toe-to-toe with him and keep it up, that's impressive.
So, Alex, what's in the MCU, because, again, you didn't really follow the comic books, what is your probably favorite Thor scene in the MCU, in the movies that he's been in?
In the movies, I really, really liked, especially this goes to my electrician thing, when he is in Thor Ragnarok, when he's on the bridge and he's kind of been, he gets hit in the head, or he gets like severely injured by Hela, and is then
on the balcony.
She and then he has a
whips his ass in the
flashback to Odin, and Odin says, "Are you not Thor, the god of thunder, not the god of hammers?
You're not the god of hammers."
Yeah, you're the god of thunder. And then on that bridge, when he just fully unleashes and kind of taps into his like elemental lightning control, and he just the music tunes in, and he just jumps, and the lightning is flying out of him as he slams down, and just those zombie like guys, he's just disintegrating them. That was amazing. His manipulation of lightning is his. In everything else, it's his far most underutilized power, because that is incredibly like that's what he needs to focus on.
Yeah, it was interesting because when he has that flashback, and what you're referring to, he basically tells Odin, he's like, "I don't have my hammer."
Yeah,
and
he's
he
like,
goes,
"Oh yeah, she's too strong. I don't have my hammer."
And then he goes, "What are you, Thor, god of hammers?"
Yeah,
and he says, "The hammer was, it's not the sorcerer power.
It was
just a focus
conduit.
Focus
Yeah,
to train
exactly.
you to use
And one of the best lines that Odin throws at him, he's like, "Even with two eyes, you can only see half the picture."
Yeah.
And then Thor's sitting on his knees, and he's looking at his dad, and he's like, I'm not as powerful as you. I'm not as strong as you." And then he walks in, he turns and, "No, you're stronger."
Yeah.
Then that's when it just...
And then at that
so
time,
good.
Thor had the one eye because Hela
that's what it was.
took
He
up
just,
himself.
that's what it was.
And
Yeah.
that's the whole thing about the wisdom of Odin gave up his eye for wisdom.
Anyway, I
Scene.
love that scene and how he sort of embodied that. You know, not necessarily he wasn't just punching and smashing things anymore. He was, you know, because you're thinking God of Thunder, like fairly underutilized skill, being that lightning is one of the most powerful forces on the planet.
Yeah.
And he's able to channel that. So that for me that's where Thor started to kind of that electric thing. That's when I tuned in.
Yeah. How about you, Jason? Do you have any favorite moments you can remember in the MCU?
In the scenes, like just even the way that the third movie just started, that scene where he's hanging from the chain there, and it's the whole scene from the beginning up there into the opening credits. It was great because he starts, so he's hanging and he's like, oh, Thor in a cage, and it does a good exposition. He drops in front of Surtur there.
Yeah.
And it shows the thing that Thor has developed a bit, and he's not just the vain Thor from the first movie.
He's grown.
That he's starting to do a little bit more cunning, that he's there, and he tricks Surtur into telling him the plan, like, you know, because all arch villains have to want to tell you the plan. But Thor
Get the monologuing.
But it was well done because Thor actually, you know, drew it out of him, and then they went into an awesome fight scene with, again, where the music comes up.
Yeah.
And this time it was just, you know, boom, hammer time, and he just laid into them and stuff. I mean, there was one minor bullshit thing in that I also think from the second movie is the fire giants and the frost giants. They're too small to be giants. I know they shrink with in the Marvel universe, they had the things where the frost giants earlier were small until it got cold enough. But I mean, these are the fire giants in their realm. They should have been a bit bigger. But that's a minor nitpick there. But in that whole scene, it was just badass. It had the humor. It encapsulated. It was a good epitome of the best of the Marvel movies. Is it had a good balance of humor and cinematic comic book fighting action, just within that little thing right from the opening until the credits started. It was a small little slice, but I thought it did a really good job of saying, like, you get a feeling for who Thor is. He's got this good humor thing that they went that way with him in the movies, but he's also badass warrior, and they did that in just a few minutes. A really good double scene.
I like when the phrase basically Surtur looks at him and he goes, Thor, son of Odin, and he's like, Surtur, son of a bitch.
Yeah.
I thought my father killed you. Yeah, that was good. Well, I mean, you mentioned bullshit, so let's go into Dane's dungeon now.
Yeah, I was just saying that was a minor thing. The scene was overall really good, but still, you know, I gotta.
Okay, so we're going to talk about Dane's dungeon briefly. We're going to talk about some of the cool things of Thor and some of the bull stuff that Thor has done in his comic book or throughout history or things like that. So we'll kind of jump into that. So you were talking about kind of the giants in the MCU. Not so good. Yeah, I agree with you.
It's just like so many of the special effects were really well done. All they had to do, it's CGI things. Come on, guys, make the giants twice as big as the things. Like, I mean, you can do it. It was a kind of oversight, and I understand. Like I said, in the comics, there was some of the thing where the frost giants were in a warm area, so they were too small. But then when they got the cold, they grew bigger.
Yeah.
But you know.
So I'm going to talk about one thing that I think is part of the cool shit here, but it's also got part of some bullshit as well. Thor's beard. Okay, I'm really down with Thor's beard.
You? Well,
really
they can't see you on camera.
Yeah.
He's got a beard like Thor.
Yes. So, in the comic, do you remember why Thor had a beard?
In the comic, I do remember why Thor had a beard.
Okay, go for it.
That brings me to one of my not really bullshit things, but one of the things that I think that wasn't as good when they changed it in the movies, but I thought I can understand why they did it. Okay, so Thor in most of the comics does not have a beard.
Right.
We talked before about the red-headed,
that was the original
red-headed
depiction,
Thor,
yeah.
but in the Marvel comics, he's got blonde hair. But another thing is that for most of the time, he doesn't have a beard. He's clean shaven.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, well, that's kind of weird.
That's not manly.
But they did fix it later on, and again in those period of comics that I really love. And in the Marvel movies, they have Hela come in later and be Odin's daughter and all that thing in the.
They changed
for the
the
movies. So
mythos a little bit.
So they changed the mythos. So we can get in. There's a few other points of bullshit about changing the mythos. But how Thor got his beard is he had a big fight with Hela, and she ended up hurting him, giving him fragile bones. They made him really weak. It was one of the great things in there. So Thor could no longer get into fights and stuff because he would just be broken. So that's where he got his armor. So Thor didn't have armor before, and then he got this super cool armor and grew a beard because he was
scarred.
He was scarred.
He was scarred from Hela's fight.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's what it was.
So that's where both the beard and the armor came from. And that was one of the big cool periods.
Yeah.
It's really hard in comics for them to be able to change a look of a character.
Yeah.
But that was a really big thing when they did that, and that was sometimes when they make the changes, it doesn't work so well, and sometimes it does. I thought that one worked really well. In fact, not the screensaver, but one of the wallpapers on my main computer actually has Thor with
the beard,
with the armor and the beard.
Yeah,
and it's not an official one from there. I should find out the fan artist because the guy
did
it better even than the Marvel.
Is fantastic, and I think so. Alex, do you like Thor with a beard or without a beard?
I like Thor with a beard for sure.
Yeah.
I think especially I think
It's Norse,
Chris Hemsworth embodies him so well,
Yeah.
and it gets better as the time goes on. So I would even say like it doesn't necessarily for me when I thought also how he did it was so beautiful when Stan Lee in Ragnarok was the guy who comes out in the gladiator arena and
cuts his hair.
and cuts his hair down. It's like, no, not my hair. It's like a big he made a big fuss about it, but Stan Lee was the guy who cut it, even though it was Chris Hemsworth's idea to cut his hair because he hated having his hair that long.
Yeah,
he was like, I'm done with it, and I thought it played brilliantly. I like the short-haired beard Thor. I think it plays.
It was a good look too.
Yeah.
But that was the funny thing because Thor in the comics has never had short hair. No. So when they did in the movies, it's like, oh my God,
probably not. There's been a lot of runoff.
Yeah.
Like after our time, I've dabbled a little bit. And there's been like lots of.
Well,
so maybe one of them.
But even like, and honestly, another thing you could say, cool shit or bullshit, is if we talk about Thor's helmet.
Okay.
To me, that's bullshit. It's old school. It's got the little wings on it. It's old school Viking. Like Vikings didn't have horns with helmets on it.
No, they didn't.
It's bullshit.
But it's got the wings. I was going to mention that the wings on the thing in the comic. That was one of the good things in the movie when he's in the arena and he gets that helm.
Yeah, he does.
And then he goes and he
little,
flips the things up and it gives the little wings. So it was a
nod to
good
that.
little nod to that.
Yeah.
And this is what I like. Sometimes the modern Marvel things do. Like the TV shows aren't as good, but remember
Power Man.
So you know where I'm going.
I knew.
Even like Iron Fist, he ties. Like they always do a scene where they try and draw back to the original. Like even Iron Man, the first Iron Man, right when he's in the cage and he's building his thing, it's a big clunky suit of armor. Like they've done a very good job in trying to draw back.
That was
to
a
the
good
original
remix of the Vietnam thing. Moved to the what was it, Afghanistan?
Yeah.
They did.
Yeah, it was well done, and I think Jason's right. I mean, they do a nod. Like the Power Man one was so good, where they briefly had him in the yellow and the headband.
Because he was running away, needed some clothes, and he got things. So he looked like the 70s thing. So it's good because you can't. Some of the stuff that worked in the 60s and 70s
won't work now.
Even 80s wouldn't work now. And you're changing it, but at least go, okay, we know we changed it. Here's a little thing that gives you a little wink of how it was. And I also mentioned earlier about the Rockmen from Saturn, about the origin story of Thor when he was fighting. Just throwing that one little guy one big guy that he had to fight in that little scene of the Rockman from Saturn. It's like anyone that complains, like, okay, good. You've checked off that box. I can not complain. So.
Okay, so let's also then talk about Thor, because he did change in the MCU, and Fat Thor in Endgame.
So cool. Cool shit.
Amazing. So a lot of people just was like, this is the dumbest shit ever. What? Because he's out of shape and he should look like a superhero, and this is dumb. And this is also fat shaming. And they totally went into
No, it wasn't fat shaming. He was owning it, Like and this is the thing. Again, Norse gods different from Greek gods. Greek gods, they were to get absolutely annihilated, hammered, drunk, or messed up. And they didn't even the god of drinking was just always fucked up, but then could just turn it off whenever he wanted.
Right.
But the gods had complete control. These gods are afflicted by the same things that mortals are afflicted by, i.e. getting fucking fat from sitting on the couch and playing video games with your boys.
It was more about the depression and stuff like that, which isn't necessarily totally against the Greek thing, because like Heracles after killing his family and stuff, he has a rather big thing of depression.
But he's also half human, though.
But he's also half human. But in a way, they're kind of parallel-ish characters too.
Right.
In a way, but anyway, sorry, that could go down a whole.
Yeah.
See how Jason does this?
Yeah.
I'm bringing it back, man. I'm trying to stay on topic. Sorry.
But yeah, that's what I'd say that the Fat Thor to me was, and it also showed that he could still be badass despite having a gut, and he didn't have to show off his physique to be a lead character.
So it wasn't just
he kicked the shit out of Thanos as Fat Thor. It was awesome.
Yeah,
it wasn't fat shaming. It was like, hey, even if you're fat, you can still be a hero. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Yeah. Like. Yeah.
So one of my bullshit moments in the MCU, which bugs me, is Thor's new weapon.
Oh, Stormbreaker.
So Stormbreaker in the comics is not, well, they eventually, but Stormbreaker originally in the comics is Beta Ray Bill's weapon, which Odin makes for him. Eitri makes it. So Beta Ray Bill is an alien who was worthy and was able to wield Mjolnir, got the power of Thor. They fought in a couple episodes, great comics episodes. Jason and I, Golden Age, we loved it.
They did make a little nod again in the movies there in on the right near the arena on the building there. They had
a
Beta
image,
Ray
yeah.
Bill. They had a statue face of him on the building there, but they didn't get into it.
Yeah, so Beta Ray Bill ends up getting because he's such a worthy adversary and he's such a good guy. Odin, he gets Eitri to make him a hammer, and Stormbreaker.
Yeah, so it's not that the hammer itself is bullshit. It's the fact that it's more the fact that Beta Ray Bill is such cool shit that not including him is.
But in the comic books now, he gets
ultimate Mjolnir. He gets a couple different weapons that are Stormbreaker-esque, but they.
So what's this ultimate thing? This is this newfangled.
Yeah,
Marvel
so
universe
they improve upon Mjolnir and get Mjolnir gets enhanced, and that's the next weapon that he gets, and then it goes off. I don't know enough about it to speak accurately on it, but it goes off on that kind of train of enhancing and getting new weapons that way. But to me, the biggest problem that I had with Stormbreaker was the whole scene when they couldn't find the handle and it's Groot's arm and he axes his own arm off. Like, first off, how can Groot just like slap his own arm off for one? Like, that seems nuts. And also, like, why did he? It didn't jive with me. It didn't make sense. I wasn't a huge fan. Like, yeah, sure, you threw Groot in there. I'm a huge Groot fan. I love Groot.
Yeah.
I didn't like how he needed to insert himself into that part of the story. I found it, kind of frustrating that they didn't have their shit together, and
That's
he needed
interesting. I had a
to fuse
different
his
take on
hand.
that little bit there.
Yeah.
Why? What was your take?
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of cool because the world tree, and I was like Groot being kind of like a root,
yes.
and then it sort of ties the thing together to
I
hold the hammer
had
together.
heard that fan theory, yeah.
When I first saw it, I was like, wow, the tree, that's like
And
nice,
that's why
nice
Thor
symbolism,
took
so.
Groot in his school or whatever he says. I don't know if college, but whatever he said, he can speak Groot's language because that's a thing in Asgard because the Groot species are descendants of the World Tree.
Oh, I did not know that. But
And
I just,
so
when I saw the
that's an
imagery, I
actual
thought
fan theory thing that Groot is a direct descendant of the World Tree.
Yeah.
And so that part is kind of cool, but I
didn't know the
still,
theory,
like,
but
you're
still.
making a hammer and you don't have your shit together, and he's like frying himself in the star. You're too busy watching Thor like cooking himself to be like, okay, guys, we need to have our shit together. Like, I don't know where the handle is.
The whole thing of making the hammer is fraught with mistakes, right? Like,
Yes,
it's
that's
not
true.
supposed to be that short.
And he's not supposed to.
The original one's handle is too short.
Yeah, and I guess it was kind of an impromptu thing, and I guess I did like that scene, especially Peter Dinklage playing the giant dwarf.
Yeah, it was
I
awesome.
love that.
That's
That
nice.
was so cool.
Nice
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really good, and they do change the mythology.
Oh, they totally do, and that's speaking about the bullshit sort of thing. They had the Hela and the Fenris wolf being
Undead.
No, the
Who they're
lineage-
related
the
to.
lineage,
Yeah.
the parentage.
Yes. Yeah.
If you want to speak to that.
Yeah,
because
to
they're
Loki.
both offspring
Loki.
of Loki.
Yeah.
But in the movies, they changed that, and in some ways, the movies are kind of compressing things. The movies are good, but it's too bad that they didn't get to be a TV series because movies don't really have the freedom to properly draw things out. Like, you got to remember, the comics have got hundreds and hundreds of issues to go over these things, and it's like decades, like 1960s. So even if it was, say, let's round it up and say 1970s, like you're 40, 50 years plus of comics here to try to compress into a few movies. It's like, yeah, they did some things wrong, but it's kind of tough. Too bad they didn't
It's
get
hard
a
to do it
TV
right
series.
with an hour
3
and a
hours.
half or 3 hours. Well, I guess 3 hours
Well,
now.
they re-released Endgame and they added more footage.
Well, they could have the deleted scenes. You know why they did that, right? It's because
Oh, they wanted to push it over the two billion.
John Wick beat them in the first weekend, and then Avatar still holds the record. So they're coming. They're hungry for it.
Did they beat it?
I don't know. It hasn't come out yet, has it?
I thought it already did.
The new Avengers.
Yeah,
Endgame?
the extended version. Did it not come
Why
out?
have we not seen it? We should go see it. I'll go see the extended again.
I don't know.
But it's basically you're saying they just did this as a.
I think that's my theory. My theory is that hey, Endgame should have been the movie to break the record, which it should. Fuck Avatar, like that's ridiculous. Like fuck 3D technology, that's bullshit. Avatar, Pocahontas remade. Avengers should be like let's everybody go see Avengers Endgame so that we break the fucking records. Come on, like.
So it's funny. They speak to the geek culture, right? I have a buddy of mine. And his name is Jeremy, and he lives in Japan. Mega geek, absolutely in love with Star Wars. Right. Everything Star Wars. Also a Marvel guy. But if they come out with extended versions, he goes watch it. You know, like I always read his posts on Facebook, and it's everything Star Wars. Love it. Oh, I went to go see Star Wars Rogue One for the 19th time. You know, that type of thing. Yeah. I own everything on Blu-ray. It's awesome. Yeah. And so he's the type of guy. It's like, oh, they have an extended version. Well, I have to go see this because I have never seen that movie before, right? Yeah. So there's always that type of person out there, present company included.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. I want to see well, it's like you show me that scene with Vision being cut out. Like that should have been in the movie. You know, like there's some scenes that they cut out that are integral to the story, and then you're like, why did you show me that 20-minute thing with that love interest that I don't care about whatsoever? You know. So anyway, it's tough. They got to make a movie, but you're right. At the end of the day, I think that Hela in the MCU, at least in the movie, was bullshit due to the compared to the actual goddess of death. Yeah, her malice, her wrath, death is such a huge thing for all of humanity, and to give that role to a woman, that's a huge.
In regards to the Norse
the Norse mythology, yes.
Yeah, it's huge.
That's
awesome.
But
it also makes sense too, right? Women are more closely linked to life.
Exactly. And they drew that parallel. And this is when we think about a god like Thor who embodies everything about a man that is, almost frowned upon these days, and yet they also have a culture that supports women. It's such a fantastic parallel that's drawn between the two of them, and how these kind of roles can be intermingled and the society can be formed.
Well, see, the great thing is, I'm going to give you a history lesson of my people. You ready? Yeah. So the great thing about the women back in the Viking age, again, we were talking about how progressive they were. Yes, she was the goddess of death, but let's take the mythology out of this. Women back then, they could be warriors. They could be shield maidens. They fought side by side with men when they went on raids. They were able to own land. They were able to divorce their husbands.
Yeah, that's a big one,
tons of stuff. So very cool. And I think that's where the Viking culture, obviously this episode is not about the Viking culture. I could go on about it, but that's why it was really progressive in many different ways. Yeah. The other thing is we're talking about Thor having red hair, and they changed it to blonde hair. So back then, having blonde hair was a sign of royalty, nobility, and so they would actually bleach their hair.
Oh, really?
So many Vikings did not have blonde hair, but they would bleach their hair blonde because it was considered the height of fashion.
Right.
They ended up showering once a week, which was their hygiene. That's very, very high.
Standards at that time that's incredibly high.
Yeah. During archaeological digs, they have found combs. They have found toothpicks or like for brushing
your teeth.
Ear picks to clean your ears and that type of thing. So they were very fastidious on how they wanted to keep clean and all these things.
It's hard when you're just pillaging and murdering all the day. You got to tidy up afterwards.
Dude, you got to clean that blood off. That Christian blood doesn't wash itself off.
But that's one of the things about the Viking culture that people totally mistake, that they think, there's these warriors and stuff. They were farmers, and the word Viking, which they used back then, Viking basically means fjord or entry of water. So it was pirating.
Yes.
Right. So
it's not all of them. It's just that's like
so your profession is your profession, but some of them would go out and so another episode for sure. Something there. But very, very cool culture that is misunderstood, and they did during a 400-year period. They ruled the world.
Yeah.
They conquered everybody. England, they went to Russia, they went down to France.
Traveling is what it still astounds me to this day, that you can literally set out in a longboat and row that across the ocean and then go fuck everybody up and steal all their shit and then go back
Yeah.
It's insanity.
And one of the things about the longship is because all the other ships during the time, they were really quite inferior. The longship could go up rivers. They could go into super shallow waters.
Because of the oars. Like, that was the whole thing. Like, they were able to just...
And
know,
all of a
like
sudden
the Pirates of the Caribbean scene where they take the oars and stick them in the cannon holes or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, the Vikings figured that shit out a long time ago.
And the great thing about the Vikings, I mean, they found the settlement of Iceland. They basically colonized Iceland. They ended up going to Canada. They discovered, that wasn't Columbus.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in 1000, year 1000, they basically came over to Newfoundland. So,
Glacial warming period, but we can do that tomorrow.
Here's an interesting trivia point about the Vikings. When the Vikings ended up going to Iceland, Iceland was covered with trees at one point.
Okay.
However, they cut down all the trees on the entire island.
To build their ships?
To burn it and all that stuff. And the problem is if you don't have trees, what happens is the soil ends up loosening and it turns into this big dust bowl.
Oh, right.
And because the erosion and stuff like that. And so they had these massive dust storms in Iceland. It actually buried a city a couple hundred years ago. And so it's very interesting. And they say that this is, I don't know if I believe this, but this is an interesting trivia point. The amount of carbon dioxide that gets put out and is not absorbed in the Iceland area is tremendous because there are no trees. Right? If you have trees, they take in the carbon dioxide, they produce oxygen.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Don't have that, so massive contributor to greenhouse gases.
Yeah. Freaking Vikings.
There you go.
Still Iceland's one of the coolest places.
Yeah.
If I didn't have so much stuff, that'd be one of the places I would think about moving to.
Totally. Yeah, I've heard it's beautiful. I haven't been there. I'd like to go there. So yeah, that's some of the cool shit and bullshit. So Jason, do you have anything else as we close out here the episode of Thor, the God of Thunder?
No, I implore people if you know, I think everybody nowadays knows Thor from the Marvel MCU. I want to encourage people to dig a little bit in, if you're a fan, to dig into that mythology and kind of see some of the old stories. They're crazy. They blow your mind. They are from people looking at the world at a different time, and the struggle is real, and I feel like that lets the fantasy be far more real.
Yeah, and the myth lives on because we're still dealing with their mythology today and remaking it. That's one of the beauties of these things. It's so many, and there's so many great episodes. Like the movies are great, but get back into the comics too. I mean, there's so many good things there. Like the world serpent, that spread between the two there with that fight and
that panel. Yeah,
you know what I like. Yep. I just mentioned it, and you can picture.
Yeah, it's very
what's
cool.
going on there. And there's so many moments like that within the thing. We talked about the celestial thing. We can get into there.
And one of the great things about Thor and the resurrection and stuff that's happening in Iceland, they basically have brought back. They constructed a temple to the Norse mythology.
Really?
Yeah. So it's
one more reason to visit.
They're bringing it back.
Wow.
So
fantastic.
It's coming kind of full circle.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. So Thor, known as the god of thunder, also of lightning and storms. He's also known as the god of the oak trees and of strength. He's also he's a protector of mankind, humankind, and also is known as the god of fertility sometimes as well. That's a little side thing. So
I gotta say,
fertility because
he gets around.
Yeah. He looks like Chris Hemsworth.
But I gotta call bullshit on this episode that we're doing here today.
What?
Why? Because we didn't touch upon something?
No. What day are we doing this on?
Yeah.
We should have done it yesterday.
Yes.
Oh, Thor's Day. That's a good point. Like literally Thursday, Thor's Day. That's
And Wednesday, Odin's Day.
Yeah.
And we get a whole bunch of words from
thing. The word thing comes from a treaty that was signed. It's a Viking thing.
Yeah.
Thing.
The word husband and wife are also Norse.
Yeah.
So there's tons of words.
Like Thor's cool. Norse mythology is cool. There's so much cool stuff to get into with that.
So thanks, guys. And this was episode 10. We were doing the God of Thunder, and we'll be back, of course, next week with something else. And until then,
Skull.
Enough said.
Enough said.